How's everybody doing? Good. Excellent. So will you be able to see this, Sarah, Cheyenne? Okay. So we're doing this class here because this is kind of a class that sort of commemorates the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, which was dubbed a war to end all wars by a number of people. It's usually associated with President Woodrow Wilson. He only said it once, though. But the war lasted from 1914 to 1918. And the goal with today's presentation is hopefully to show you not only how significant a conflict this was at the time, but how it has shaped the world since then. So the First World War lasts 4 years. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about really a number of different items. We're going to talk about the nature of the conflict. So I have a lot of imagery to show you in addition to what you see on your sides here. Over here, this image, which will be up during the presentation, is wounded British soldiers at the end of the war, 1918. Over here you see one of the infamous images of the trenches of the Western Front and the just complete destruction of the landscape caused by the war. So we'll talk about the nature of the conflict. We're going to ask ourselves, what were the causes of the conflict? Is there any party that we should consider most responsible? And then we'll consider the end of the conflict and its consequences, short-term and long-term. All right? So the first thing I want to do is talk about the results of the war. Let's go to the end of the war and talk about the ramifications of this for humanity. I have some statistics up here for you to just give you an idea of what to think about when you're talking about the scale of this conflict. Approximately 9.9 million soldiers were killed, upwards of 21 million wounded, 7.7 million civilian casualties during the war. Of the total casualties of service members, you're talking about a percentage of like 45.6% of soldiers mobilized were either killed or wounded. So almost half of the soldiers, almost 70 million soldiers that were mobilized to fight in the First World War, almost half of them were either killed or wounded. And that doesn't count figures of prisoners of war or missing in action. So it's a really staggering number. World War I is a conflict where you saw the first air raids, albeit they weren't on the scale of a conflict like World War II, for example. But the first air raids of cities occurred during World War I. The Germans, of course, used Zeppelins as airships to try to, use bombs to terrorize the civilian population in southern England. So it's the first war to have air raids. Heavy artillery, which I will show you an image of, heavy artillery during the First World War was probably, almost definitely, the most destructive component. The British, prior to the war, just the British alone, manufactured upwards of 3 million artillery shells before the war began. To give you an idea, before the Napoleonic Wars began, Napoleon had amassed some 20,000. So 100 years later, you're talking about a massive difference in terms of the level of destruction. And of course, the shells could be shot longer, explosive shells. They could carry chemical gas. They were much more destructive and much more powerful. The end of the First World War sees the emergence of the first major genocide of the 20th century, the Armenian genocide, which happened after the Ottoman Empire collapsed and the state of Turkey began to form. It's a war that also gave rise in the latter stages at the end of the war of the second worst pandemic in human history, second only to the Black Death. And this, of course, was the Spanish flu. I've heard some people in here say that they have family members that are stricken with the flu currently, and hopefully nobody is carrying the Spanish flu. I'm very confident that nobody is, but in all seriousness, this was a devastating illness that, the interconnections of the world that were accelerated by World War I, right? Troops being moved throughout the world increased the spread of this illness. My great-grandmother died in Scotland, in Edinburgh, from the Spanish flu. We've talked in this class a lot about global interconnectivity, right? The interconnections of the world. We went back to the Columbian Exchange and we talked about the movements of Spaniards to the Americas, right? And the ramifications of that for the Old World and the New World, right? World War II, with those industrial technologies that we talked about in class, speeds the interconnections of the globe at a rate, never before foreseen. And that played into the development of pandemic disease in the case of the Spanish flu, which, by the way, tended to kill folks that were in their middling ages. For whatever reason, the Spanish flu tended to affect people in their middle age groupings more than the young or the elderly. Of course, World War I also is associated with the emergence of what we call today post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Of course, during World War I, they didn't understand it like this. The understanding of mental illness had a long, long way to go. During World War I, it was called shell shock. And it was called that because it tended to be associated with people's exposure to the extreme artillery barrages of the First World War. This picture here is from the Battle of the Somme, and this is a German in the middle, a German prisoner who's actually helping British wounded soldiers. And it's kind of an interesting picture, not only because the Somme in the summer of 1916 was a devastating battle. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But it also shows you that during World War I, it was interesting because the combatant sides, the actual people themselves, in moments, despite the utter destruction that was being unleashed all around them, in certain strange cases, saw the humanity of each other. And it comes out in certain moments during the conflict, the most devastating conflict in human history, to this point at least. World War II, of course, would surpass that. So World War II is what we call a war of attrition. It's an industrial war. Does anybody have an idea? When we say something is a war of attrition, what do we mean? So Brad said, in a war of attrition, the goal is basically to survive longer than your opponent, right? How would you describe a war of attrition? If the goal is to basically outlast your opponent, what does a war of attrition typically look like? Okay, so you might associate with hunkering down, as you said, or throwing everything you have at the enemy. During World War I, people hunkered down in trenches, like the one you'll see over here, and of course on the slides you'll see some other images of trenches, right? Artillery barrages hurled at the other side with the goal of trying to break through the lines. But ultimately, in a war of attrition, if you're trying to outlast the enemy, what method do you think you will use to try to ultimately defeat the enemy? So, as you see right here, this is, of course, in this image, this is, of course, the British Navy. And what Brad said was you rely on blockades. You try to deny them the necessary supplies to not only make war, but to feed their population, right? The British, of course, blockade, Germany's coast during the war. And we'll talk about Germany's reaction to that in a little bit and how it factors into how the victorious powers, the Allies, particularly the French and the British, evaluate Germany at the end of the war. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it's an industrial war. It's associated with a long-term stalemate. The war becomes a subterranean war, particularly on the Western Front. Subterranean meaning soldiers in trenches, but not simply in trenches like this. The trenches were actually connected by tunnels, bunkers that went deep underground. Soldiers basically, when they weren't launching an offensive, when they were at the front, were effectively underground in the trench system. So it's associated with stalemate, trenches, and it's also associated not only with blockades, this is associated with some of the most incomprehensible scale of destruction. In the Battle of the Somme, the picture that I showed you from the last slide, the British shelled the German lines for 7 days straight. They launched some 1 to 1.5 million explosive shells upon the German lines. Some of those were explosive, some of those were gas, chemical gas, right? The idea with that, they didn't just accept it was a stalemate. The enemy on either side, whether it was the Germans and the British enemy or the British and the German enemy, or the French, they're constantly trying to use technology to gain an upper hand. So they might launch an offensive, break through the enemy's line, and win major territory. In the Somme, those 1.5 million shells launched at the enemy for a week. The British soldiers were then told to go over the top, which is what is referring to getting out of the trenches and launching an assault against the enemy lines. And they found that the enemy lines were largely intact. German machine guns were operating. Barbed wire was in place. The result of that was catastrophic. The British Army lost 20,000 in the first day. And because of a tendency in the British, and this is unfathomable to comprehend this, but because of a tendency in the British Army at the time, they allowed volunteers to fight with their friends. What's the ramification of allowing volunteers to fight with their friends when you see 20,000 people die in the first day? What are the ramifications for the home front? Okay, so the ramifications, to sum up the comment, the ramifications are that you have neighborhoods in Great Britain that in a matter of minutes basically become neighborhoods where almost every married person becomes a widow because all of the people from the neighborhood were fighting together and faced almost immediate death in some cases. The Battle of the Somme ultimately is a battle where upwards of over 1 million people died in the battle. Simultaneously, the Battle of Verdun is being fought further south in France. These are on the Western Front. Okay? The Somme is up north towards the border of Belgium. Verdun is in the south towards the border with Germany and near Luxembourg, okay, in France. That battle is being fought simultaneously. It had similar statistics. The longest running battle of World War I was Verdun. It lasted almost the entire year of 1916. I want to give you, there's not a whole lot of notes in these slides, but I just want to give you some imagery of the First World War. What technology do you see depicted here on the slide? So this is an example of poison gas. We see here British soldiers fitted out with gas masks. This could be mustard gas, it could be chlorine gas. Those were the two most common types of chemical weapon used during the war. And of course, these are horrifying weapons. They singe and burn the lungs. People who survive it can suffer long-term lung disease. It blinds people. And of course, death is particularly agonizing. Now, if any of you pay attention to current events, is the issue of chemical weapons, is this still a pertinent issue in modern warfare? Yeah, so Mauricio is bringing up the poison gas attacks in Syria, right? Which of course the United Nations has condemned these actions. As a result of the First World War, it becomes widely accepted by the Western world that these types of weapons should not be used. The League of Nations in the 1920s basically said these weapons should not be used in warfare. It effectively made poison gas, a widely accepted sort of war crime, right? The relevance of the First World War. Of course here, and I should have said this earlier on, I hope there are some graphic images, and so I should have actually clarified that, but there are some images here that you might see as rather graphic and difficult. But here, of course, you see a tank from the First World War. This is a British tank. Tanks were used as a form of infantry support. They're not used in the way that they're used during the Second World War with Blitzkrieg, where you have tank divisions. They're used sporadically amongst the infantry. It's a very primitive technology. The cannons are pretty small in caliber. They're slow. They go 4 or 5 miles an hour. They tend to fill with carbon monoxide. They break down all the time. So some of these weapons, too, are in the very early phases of their development. Of course, the machine gun. Here you see soldiers operating one of the numerous machine guns in use in the Western Front. And the machine gun is largely a defensive weapon used to defend infantry assaults. And of course, along with heavy artillery, the machine gun is probably the most devastating weapon of the war because of your ability to spray tremendous amounts of bullets and kill lots of people in high number with only a few people manning a single gun in a certain location. The U-boat, of course, which we will see is very relevant, the submarine, is very relevant to the German naval war. And we will see it's also relevant to how the Allies think about Germany in the aftermath of the war. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But I want to show you a few more images from the war, giving you the context here. What kind of war was this? This is an example of some of the heavy artillery that these are the biggest, these are the rail guns of the First World War. Of course, there's artillery of all sizes. And it's during the First World War II that the sort of small size mortars are developed as well. If you've ever seen a movie from like World War II or something, and you see the soldier drop the shell down the little tube, the 3-inch mortar goes up in the air on the enemy lines, right? Those were developed. It's called the Stokes mortar. Those were a British development. They were developed during the First World War as well. This is the largest of the type, the rail guns. They had to be moved on railroads to put them in place. And of course here, aerial technology, biplanes. Many of you probably heard of, the Red Baron, right? And of course, Zeppelins. You see here, a poster from Great Britain about, promoting volunteering in the service, of course, and also demonstrating the threat of a potential air raid from a Zeppelin in Great Britain. Now, what is interesting here, this individual that you see in the plane here is Eddie Rickenbacker. Eddie Rickenbacker was the United States' most significant fighter ace during the First World War, and there's something very interesting about him. At home in the United States, do you think the First World War, when the United States became involved in 1917, do you think there was significant effect on the American populace in terms of how they viewed ethnic German people? Yeah. There's resentment and distrust. There's also a lot of propaganda in the United States against, Germans, those of German descent. Eddie Rickenbacker's name wasn't originally spelled that way. Towards the end of the war, he changed the spelling to a more English-looking spelling because he didn't want to be. He was of German descent, and he did not want his name to indicate Germanic descent. One example of the degree to which there was almost an anti-German hysteria for a period of time in the United States, much of it the product of the United States government using propaganda. Okay? People in some cases changed their name. Things like sauerkraut, periodically called victory cabbage. So it affects home front significantly as well as the United States home front. I want to show you a few images of the trenches, then we'll talk about some specifics. I'm going to ask you about the causes of the war a little bit. These are two images from the Battle of the Somme, this one here from the Battle of Flanders Field in Belgium. And these really demonstrate how extreme life in the trenches could be. You see all these soldiers down here in the mud in Belgium, which became a real problem at Flanders Field. The mud could be quite deep. And of course, what are the ramifications for a soldier who's standing in mud for a long period of time? Yeah, so soldiers had to suffer maladies like trench foot, where you had this painful sort of rot on your foot. During Vietnam, they would call it jungle boot. Very uncomfortable environment in certain cases. Soldiers often, when they were at the front, soldiers spent a lot of time in dugouts like this, and dugouts could go pretty deep into the earth. A number of meters down into the earth. It could protect you from shelling. There could be very tight, cramped quarters. And of course, this is one of the reasons why you could shell enemy positions so long and still face such resistance. So life in the trenches, and if you ever have a chance, I highly recommend it, if you ever have a chance to go to Europe, you get a chance to go to Belgium. Belgium has some very interesting preserved historical sites where, you know, the remnants of shell holes are still there and seen, and the remnants of the trenches are still there. So in places near Ypres, for example, a town where there's a lot of fighting, you can actually really kind of go there and, you know, imagine this history, again, 100 years in the past. Of course, just before I get to asking you a question about the causes of the war, barbed wire played a very significant role in the war too. It was you might not think it, but barbed wire was a product of the Industrial Revolution. It was a defensive tool. These lined all of the trenches. It made it very difficult for offensive soldiers approaching the lines to be able to, you know, break through the lines, because you had to get through the barbed wire, and soldiers would get hung up on the barbed wire and killed, as is demonstrated in the lyrics, part of the lyrics of this British infantry soldier song. How do you think British officers felt about the infantry having little songs like this? I mean, if you read the lyrics, right? They didn't like it very much. They thought this was bad for morale. But it really is a testimony to just how much of a military tool and a danger barbed wire was to an offensive infantry assault. So we talked a little bit about this previously. What caused the conflict? Maybe somebody I haven't heard from yet. What were some of the causes of the conflict? Okay, Abigail went right to the catalyst, the assassination of the Archduke to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Franz Ferdinand, right? Definitely, but longer term than that, the assassination of the Archduke, which we'll talk about in a moment, is absolutely a key catalyst for war, right? But longer term, what types of things are happening that we're sort of putting the pieces together where an event like that might have that kind of effect? Okay, so there's a huge, what Isaiah said is he said there's arms races. People are building up weapons. People are stockpiling a tremendous amount of weaponry. I mentioned the British had stockpiled almost 3 million artillery shells. The French had begun conscription for a number of years before the conflict, right? The British were also, before I put those notes up here for you, the British are also involved in an arms race with the Germans, particularly over naval equipment. Anybody else want to add something to this before? What's a key cause? Let me ask you this question. I mean, let's be honest, okay? Let's just be honest here. And then Alex gets his shot here. Maybe Alex wants to answer this question. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo. It's in the country of Bosnia today. Most people probably couldn't even locate it on a map. It's a very significant European city, but let's face it, it's not Berlin, it's not Paris. So why should the assassination of a person in a little southeastern city in the Balkans, why should that matter? How can that start a world war? Okay, and we would associate that impulse with what? She said they're trying to get out of Austria-Hungary. They're trying to step away from Austria-Hungary. What is that impulse during this period of time? Okay, national sovereignty, and connected to it, the issue of nationalism, right? Nationalism. The idea of a people's, to become independent from a large imperial domain, right? So Abigail, you're absolutely right. We're going to talk about it. The assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is very significant. It's significant largely because of nationalism within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which challenges the authority of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It means that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is very interested, the Austrian leadership is very interested in being sure that other national movements are not going to gain independence if they try to kill Austrian leaders. Okay? So we have, like Zaya, you were talking about, we have arms races, you have colonial competition. Navies are being competed with. They're threatening the British Empire from their perspective, the German Navy is. Weapons are being built. Soldiers are being conscripted. There's also old disputes, territorial disputes. The little area of Alsace and Lorraine, which today is part of France at the time of the war. I'll show you on a map in just a moment. At the time of the First World War, it was part of Germany. It had been taken after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. It was a territory that the Germans and the French had vied for quite a while. And so you have these old animosities, old disputes, arms races, and nationalism. And these factor in creating a system of alliances that are more complex than this, but to simplify this, the alliances are basically a close-knit alliance between Germany and Austria, France and Russia and Serbian nationalists. I'll show you a map that kind of demonstrates this for you in a moment. Well, actually, how about right now? The military alliances of 1914. Obviously, in the brownish color are the Central Powers. Italy would not remain in the Central Powers. And of course, the Ottoman Empire would eventually join the Central Powers. And of course, France and Russia as allies, and the British come in a little bit later. Well, I mean, not a little bit later, but not immediate. It's at the beginning of the war, but they're trying to stay out before the French are attacked. And we'll talk about that in just a moment, why that's so significant. But if you look at this map, again, if you look at Austria-Hungary, what do you see with Austria-Hungary? What's significant about the part of the map with Austria-Hungary? What do all those little names represent? Yeah, those are the various different national groups, many of which afterwards will have states after the Treaty of Trianon. At the end of the war, will have states created out of this old empire. Okay, so you have the Ukrainians, the Poles, Slovaks, and of course down here, the Serbs. And it's of course here in Sarajevo where Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. So Germany is aligned exclusively with Austria-Hungary. The Russians are aligned with Serbian nationalists. They see themselves as sort of a kinship. They're both of Slavic heritage, right? The French are aligned with the Russians, and that's largely because of French concerns about a potential German attack at some point. And the Russians with the French. In a way, that alliance is a strange alliance because they've fought each other earlier in the 1800s, but it's an alliance largely because they're concerned about the expanding power of Germany in Central Europe. So this is how the map looks. Okay? The catalyst of war, a famous romanticized, I suppose you would say, or artistic depiction of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke to the Austro-Hungarian throne in 1914, June 28th, 1914. He was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, who's a young, impressionable individual. He's part of a group called the Black Hand. And actually, the assassination story is a very interesting narrative in its own right. There was an early attempt during his travel through the city to kill him that failed. He returned, his driver sort of got lost. Anyway, through a circumstance like this, it leads Princip to be able to successfully kill both Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. If you were the Austrian leadership, okay, considering what we've just kind of learned from looking at that map, if you were the Austrian leadership, and the heir, this is the person, okay, the king of Austria is pretty old. He is the heir to the throne. He is going to be the new leader. If the heir was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist, what might your position be? How would you handle this? How do you think the Austrians will handle this? Yeah, they want to crush the Serbian nationalists. They want to use this as an example. They want to use this as an example. And ultimately, this event will trigger a series of war declarations. They will put an ultimatum on Serbia that Serbia is almost guaranteed to refuse. Okay? They basically say, you effectively have to be occupied. This is simplifying it, but they basically had to accept an Austrian occupation, more or less, to find out those responsible, the culprits of the crime. And they blame the Serbian government as well. Serbia, of course, refuses on the basis of what principle? National sovereignty, right? When they refuse, Austria will declare war. And it triggers a series of war declarations that leads, with those treaties we talked about, those alliance systems, it leads to a continental and then ultimately a world war. Now, the Guns of August is typically referred to, that is typically used to reference the beginning of the war, which starts the beginning of August 1914. And I'm going to come back and ask you a question about this in just a second. So it's about a month from the assassination to August before war begins. It might surprise you, given the images that we've seen, the images you see, in the room right now, as well as on the slides that we looked at, that there was actually a euphoria about war. There was almost an excitement about war. Nobody thought this was going to be a long, drawn-out industrial stalemate. Nobody thought it was a war where 45% of the soldiers mobilized would wind up either dead or wounded, and often horribly wounded. There's a tremendous amount of amputations from the First World War, or mentally wounded, right? Many times people went off to volunteer in a celebratory sense, right? And of course, the book, All Quiet on the Western Front, sort of tells this narrative, the famous book that was written, of course, shortly after the war. Here you see the declaration of war of the Kaiser, of the German Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm II being read here. And here you see German students off to enlist in what they expect will be a great conflict that will earn them heroism, valor, and great accomplishments for Germany. Going back to look at this map briefly. Who is most responsible, though? This is one of the overarching questions. It's a question that the victorious powers will deal with at the end of the war. Who is most responsible? Do you think there's any country, before I go to the next slide, do you think any country had the ability to prevent Austria-Hungary from declaring war on Serbia? So, to paraphrase, and this is Kaiser Wilhelm, Germany is a very powerful country in Europe. In a lot of respects, they're probably the most powerful country in Europe. Not only militarily, they're also leading the way on aspects of technological development. They've developed things like workers' pension before almost any other developing world or developed country has achieved. They're on the forefront economically. They're not only an economic and industrial powerhouse, but they're also a military powerhouse. Okay? Was Germany to blame? In the aftermath of the assassination, Mauricio is right. It's really with Germany. I'll just put these up here for you. It's really with Germany in terms of power to stop this event. Kaiser Wilhelm, pictured here, is generally regarded as probably not a great leader. Okay, let's just say that. Historians have not treated Kaiser Wilhelm well. The second, of course, not his father. They have not treated him well. He tended to be erratic. He made decisions that were sometimes based on emotional outbursts. And Germany at this time, their leadership, in terms of foreign policy, he controlled basically all the appointment power. And so the war was made by effectively Kaiser Wilhelm II and a clique of German military leaders, despite the fact that the German Reichstag was not nearly as eager for war and much more like socially progressive, to use that word. The German Reform Socialist movement was really significant in the German government. Kaiser Wilhelm, the ultimatum on Serbia, basically refused to dissuade Austria. In fact, Germany actually encouraged Austria to get on with it more quickly. And there seems to be evidence to suggest that the Germans hoped that this war could be an opportunity for Austria and Germany to use war as a tool to expand their power. And so he didn't dissuade Austria. Germany encouraged Austria. Now, is that enough to what's called the blank check, is what it's called, the fact that Germany basically gave Austria a free hand to do what they wished? Is that enough to say we should blame Germany for the war? I don't think historians would go that far. But Kaiser Wilhelm was in a particularly powerful position if Germany was going to prevent the occurrence of this conflict. Rather than dissuading Austria, though, they gave Austria what's called the blank check. Basically a free hand. If you make war on Serbia, if Russia gets involved, Germany promised they would handle the situation. So that's the first thing that leads historians, and particularly the victorious powers, to consider Germany more at fault in the war. Now, this does not mean, we're going to talk about the end of the war, this does not mean the treaties that end the war, particularly the one with Germany, was the right kind of treaty. Certainly the victorious allies believed that. But we see a series of events. As the war goes on, you see a series of events where a number of events happen in the war that lead the victorious powers to effectively blame Germany for the conflict. The first one is the blank check. It's basically giving Austria-Hungary a free hand to crush Serbia. The second generally is referred to as the Schlieffen Plan, a gamble on the part of the German military leadership that was created before the First World War by Alfred von Schlieffen. So I was just asking you this question. What is, if Germany is going to fight this war, once the war declarations have occurred, what is the central problem for Germany in terms of the strategic outlook of the war, the overall condition of the war? They have a two-front war, right? Before I put the notes up here, you have France on one side, you have Russia on the other side, right? If you are the German leadership, how would you deal with the two-front war? Okay, so you have to eliminate one of the fronts. The idea would be you would focus on one first and then take care of the other. Now, somebody else, you don't have to know the answer right now, but if you were to think, consider what you know just about Russia from looking at a map and consider what you know about France. Who might you target first and why? Tierra said France, and that's correct. The second part, weaker and smaller, probably not as correct. They're smaller, probably not weaker, but you're correct in where you're going with that. They target France, and the reason they do this is because, France is actually very powerful militarily. They're also more industrially advanced than Russia was. And so the idea they believed was that it would take a lot longer for the Russians to mobilize, okay? And it would take a lot shorter for the French to mobilize. So you naturally attack the French first. Now, the French are a very powerful military. They're a very powerful country. So they go through the Low Countries. The Low Countries are Belgium, particularly. You beat France and then you fight Russia. This is the goal. Why is this important? Why are we talking about this? This was called the Schlieffen Plan. The idea to invade France through neutral Belgium, capture Paris, take France out of the war, and then turn to Russia. Why does this matter? Why are we talking about this? Why is this important? Okay, so he says when they go through Belgium, it brings in the British Empire. It expands the scale of the war. That's correct. Somebody else, why would going through Belgium? So we're back to that kind of catch-all we've been talking about of international relations throughout this course. Belgium is a sovereign nation. And not only are they a sovereign nation, as Alex just pointed out, they're one that the British have agreed to protect. And so it's important because the British will now get involved because of a violation of Belgian sovereignty. It's also important for another reason. Down the line, why do you think this matters for the end of the war? It's another reason to declare Germany responsible for the war. There's a series of events not dissuading Austria at the beginning of the war, the invasion of Belgium. In any invasion of a country, you can expect civilians will be killed. These are increasingly viewed as atrocities by the Allies, and at the end of the war, this becomes another item that the Allies look to say, aha, Germany, you're responsible for this. Therefore, we are going to enact on you a very harsh treaty. I'll show you a little map. The reason I'm showing you this map, no notes on here or anything, I just want to show you, just to identify on the map where we're talking about. So the reason you don't, this is the border between Germany and France, okay? If you attack here, it's naturally assumed that the French will expect this. If you attack through Belgium, right here, a neutral country, you naturally think they won't expect that. And that's the idea. Now, I'm going to move through a slide here kind of quickly, but I just want to briefly talk about it because you're probably not surprised to learn that it fails, right? You don't have to write these notes down. But, you know, that probably doesn't surprise you because if it had succeeded, maybe it would have been a short war. Maybe the map of Europe would look completely different. But it fails. The German army can't move fast enough, and they're ultimately halted and repulsed to a certain extent at the Marne River, in the Battle of the Marne. And after the Schlieffen Plan is halted, the German forces are pushed back somewhat. The Western Front goes subterranean. And you have images of the trenches as we see in the room right now. They begin building trenches. To give you an idea about, like, trenches were not a few foxholes. The trenches in World War I, if you put them all in a line, anybody want to guess how many miles they would be? 2,000 miles. If you put all the trenches of World War II, of both powers together, it'd be 25,000 miles long. 25,000 miles long. To give you an idea, it's basically 3,000 miles from coast to coast of the United States. It's a lot of subterranean trench warfare in the First World War. Again, when we think about the end of the war and the consequences of the war and who is ultimately labeled as responsible for the war, the naval warfare is very significant as well. This is an image of the Lusitania, and the map here is basically the shaded area around the British Isles and Ireland is the area that would have been considered, you know, a war zone, all right? And this here is the warning to people sailing on the Lusitania that you are sailing on a passenger liner, but you're sailing into a potential war zone. And it could be dangerous. Basically is what is being notified here. The Germans, to break the British blockade, have to use submarines. The British have a huge above-water navy. Germany has limited coastline. The above-water navy is facilitating a blockade on Germany. The response of Germany is to use submarines and U-boats to break that blockade by doing kind of a reverse blockade of Great Britain and effectively sinking any vessel that it might deem to be a target. In May of 1915, the Lusitania was sunk, and with it, it took almost 1,200 people. The ship was sunk off the coast of southern Ireland. A question I love to ask on the test. Where was the Lusitania when it sank? A little freebie there. Off the southern coast of Ireland, right down here. It sank in about 18 minutes, which, if any of you know anything about the Titanic, and in the incredibly accurate movie that Leonardo DiCaprio was in, kidding, of course, but the Titanic sank slowly, right? This ship sank incredibly quickly. Does anybody know, like, anything about the backstory of the Lusitania? I mean, first of all, before I ask you the backstory, what do the Allies, the British, the Americans, what do they say about the Germans sinking of the Lusitania? Yeah. They're like, here you go again. These are war crimes. Germany is targeting civilian passengers. What do you think the German government said about the Lusitania? They said there were passengers on that ship, that's true. But they said it's a military transport ship and it was carrying military supplies. An allegation that was in fact true. Now, and actually, you know, a lot of those supplies were on the ship's manifest. It wasn't entirely a secret. All of the military supplies were not public knowledge, but some of it was transporting things, and this made it a target, okay? And so there's this back and forth. Now, The United States makes a response in this, however. What do you think President Woodrow Wilson, what do you think his response is on the sinking of the Lusitania? Dawson says, well, maybe he warns them, and that's exactly what he does. The United States under Wilson doesn't want to go to war. Wilson wins the election in 1916 basically on a platform of we're not going to war. So Wilson says that this was a terrible thing for the Germans to do, and ultimately the United States is a neutral country, and Americans, and certainly American ships, should not be targeted on the high seas. The U.S. should be allowed to trade freely. He effectively demands that Germany stop unrestricted submarine warfare. When he says unrestricted submarine warfare, what you mean by this is that the Germans were not warning. Their submarines are under the surface. They find a ship, they sink it regardless, right? Wilson says you have to stop this, and we're a neutral country, and if you target the United States, we're going to cut off diplomatic relations, which is like a first step to war. Do you think it is a practical policy of the United States to have the position that there's a huge war going on in Europe, but we're a neutral country and we have a huge amount of resources and equipment and supplies that we can provide, food. We should be allowed to trade with whoever we want. Given what we know about the conflict right now, do you think what do you think about that policy? What are the decisions that are being made by the United States government? Yeah, so your two options. What Alex is pointing out is he said you really have two options. Your first option is to trade with no one. If you trade with no one, that is not going to be great for your economy, right? It's just not. That's basically the policy that Thomas Jefferson used when he was president and there were dealings with France and Britain on the high seas. He said, we're not trading with anybody. Wilson says, we are a neutral country. He believes in these rights. He says, we have a right to trade with anybody. And that's certainly the best economic decision. What's the problem with it? Is there a problem with it? What's the inevitable consequence? Okay, so it could be potentially something that can cause an expansion of the war. Can the United States easily trade with Germany? Geographic location and what? The blockade, right? The British are not going to, you're not going to sail an American ship into blockaded waters and the British are going to say, oh yeah, it's fine, you guys are neutral, so sail on through. So because of the blockade, America is primarily trading with the British, the Allies, right? So what do you think Germany's position will be on that? Germany is going to basically start to see the United States as an ally of the British. And that is going to potentially make the United States a target of German submarine warfare. To make a long story short here, and we're almost done, it's World War I, believe it or not. This is like the crib note version of World War I. Historians have written massive books on World War I. It is a global conflict, so there's so many theaters you can discuss. And we're kind of focusing on the Western theater of the war, particularly here. The Germans initially say, okay, the war's early. We might still be able to win on land. We might be able to actually win this war quick if we have a successful offensive. And Germany says, okay, we won't use unrestricted submarine warfare. They stopped, and instead what they started doing was restricted submarine warfare, which meant you sight a vessel, you surface, okay, just to let everybody know, we're going to sink this ship, so you might want to get off the boat before we sink it. How practical a policy is that if you're trying to break? What do you think merchant ships do? You think they stop going there if they know that the submarine that's going to sink their ship is going to surface every time? They start putting guns on the ships, and the submarines surface, and they shoot at the submarines. It's not going to work for Germany long term if Germany can't win quickly on the continent, right? And so as a result of that, by 1916, 1917, Germany has to resume unrestricted submarine warfare from its view. It's at a position where the blockade is having a significant effect. They're having very serious problems on the home front. And Germany resumes unrestricted U-boat war. The United States eventually cuts off diplomatic relations as there's a series of controversial targetings of ships. And then, of course, the Zimmermann telegram, the infamous message from the foreign minister Zimmerman to which country? Mexico. What were they trying to achieve? What they were basically saying is, we're now in a point where we have to pull out all stops to try to win this war. The U.S. is probably going to get involved because we are back to the unrestricted submarine warfare. So let's try to keep them out of the war. In the Zimmerman note, from what we understand, it was intercepted. The United States learned of it. The idea behind it was to encourage Mexico to attack the western United States, tie the United States down, and the Germans said, if it's all successful, you'll be rewarded the territories seized in the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, Texas and California and so forth. Of course, it's intercepted. It is the last straw. President Woodrow Wilson, painting of him here, declares war, well, Congress declares war on April 4th, 1917. And the U.S. becomes involved in the war. Our biggest contribution was psychological, by the way, though we did serve in Americans did serve in a number of very significant campaigns. And in fact, most of you probably don't know that technically the most costly single campaign for the United States actually occurred in the First World War during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, in which the Americans lost, had casualties well over 20,000. It's not the worst single day event. Of course, Antietam from the Civil War. It's not the most deadly, single sort of event, but in terms of an entire campaign, the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So even for the United States, who's in the war late, even for the United States, World War I was really a devastating conflict. And of course, as I mentioned, the Spanish flu, which of course comes to the United States largely because of the interconnections and the trade and movements of people during the First World War, resulted in significant deaths in the United States. In fact, at the time, more deaths in the United States up to that point than all American wars to that point combined. I believe it was upwards of 1 million Americans died in the Spanish flu in the year it arrived from overseas. As I sum up here, I want to show you this image, and then I want to talk a little bit about what Europe looks like, briefly, at the end of the war. This is a town in northern France, near the border of Belgium, and this is what it looks like at the end of the war. Towns that were near the front lines are absolutely devastated. In Belgium, the town of Ypres in Belgium looked kind of similar. Now, you'd be amazed if you travel to Ypres today. I've been to some of these memorials particularly Belgium. And if you go to Ypres, where there are memorials to the war, you'd be amazed that the cathedral looks like it was never destroyed. And you see pictures of it from the war, and you're like, it's unbelievable how the people rebuilt. But this is really a testament to the devastation of modern military technology. At the end of the war, and we're going to kind of sum up here, so I want to just briefly talk about the treaty. I'll put it all up here for you. At the end of the war, Germany is labeled a culprit because of their usage of unrestricted submarine warfare. They were the first country to use chemical gas, but all the major combatant powers did, certainly the British. They were responsible for the so-called blank check, and of course they had invaded France through neutral Belgium. And the Allies took this and they said, Germany's really most responsible. Germany is the culprit. The Versailles Treaty was put together without a German delegation involved in the negotiation. They were basically, the German government, the new government, which was the Weimar Republic, was basically given the treaty and said, sign this, or else. And in that, they were forced to sign a war guilt clause, where they were forced to accept guilt and responsibility for the war. The treaty was very harsh on the Central Powers. Germany had a lot of territory taken from it. It had all of its colonies taken. It lost a lot of European territory. Of course, you're not surprised, Alsace and Lorraine is one of the European territories lost from Germany. The Rhineland, a major territorial area between the Rhine River the Low Countries and portions of France, is made a demilitarized zone. And Germany is basically stripped of having any meaningful military. They're limited to a military of about 100,000 people. Of 100,000 people, they're not allowed to have any heavy artillery or air force, which was probably one of the factors why the Germans ultimately became cutting edge when it came to rocket technology, of course, by the early 1930s. And of course, by World War II, the Germans developed the first ballistic missile during World War II, Werner von Braun, of course. They are strapped with massive reparations payments, $33 billion. And you're like, oh, this is the 21st century. $33 billion is nothing. Got $33 billion right here. But in today's currency, $33 billion is over $400 billion. These are massive reparation payments. Similarly, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the Treaty of Trianon is completely dismantled. This once large empire is broken up into a number of different countries. I'll show you on the map here in a moment. Those different national movements, they're all given their own countries. Hungary is now much smaller. Austria, much smaller. Now, before I show you the last slide, which is just a map, just want to show you what the map of Europe looks like at the end of the war. I have a last question for you. Maybe somebody we haven't heard from yet would be great. For the coming decade or two, what kind of ramifications do you think this type of a treaty has? This is a really harsh treaty. The Treaty of Versailles, even though a lot of scholars would argue that Germany probably held a certain level of responsibility due to the blank check with Austria, it did invade neutral Belgium. You know, certainly those are true. But I don't think there's very many scholars that would say that this was entirely a just treaty. Certainly President Woodrow Wilson, and I get back to the question in a moment, President Woodrow Wilson famously sought to obtain something that might be called peace without victory. Woodrow Wilson was at the Versailles Treaty. He wanted to use the treaty to kind of remake the world, to make the world safe for democracy. There were all kinds of tremendous ideas. But Woodrow Wilson really lost out to the victorious imperial powers, particularly the British and the French. Okay? Wilson wanted peace without victory. What do you think peace without victory meant? Do you think it meant the Treaty of Versailles? Yeah, so what Michael, if I can paraphrase Michael, he says, what happened is a treaty that really punished the defeated powers. And Woodrow Wilson was probably hoping for a treaty that was less harsh on the defeated powers, because the ramifications of that, could be a tremendous amount of animosity after the fact, right? Peace without victory. When you have victory, it's historically the case that the victor takes the spoils, meaning oftentimes they punish the defeated in some way. During the Franco-Prussian War, Alsace and Lorraine annexed, right? Part of Germany, right? He saw these types of treaties as something that would bring about war again, right? It punishes the other side. The other side then creates animosities. And that's really borne out. The attitude of the British and the French after Versailles, after World War I, towards another war, they're very defensive. They don't want another war. The French build the Maginot Line, a huge defensive complex on the border between France and Germany. They want nothing to do with war. Everything in their thinking militarily is defensive. What happens in Germany? They want payback, he says. The Treaty of Versailles became one piece of a myriad of propaganda used by radical groups, particularly the Nazis in the 1920s. It's not the only piece, right? But it's one that they put at a very key part of their propaganda against the government of Germany and against the former Allies. And so when the Nazis begin to rise to power in the early 1930s, radical fascist movement, they're seeking revenge. They begin militarizing. They begin preparing for expansion and war. And in Nazi propaganda, They wanted to avenge what they saw as a crime committed against Germany. And so the Versailles Treaty was a very negative treaty, and it was one that certainly helped to fan the flames of radicalism in Germany. It is not the only factor, but it helped fan the flames of radicalism in Germany after the First World War, and that carried long-reaching consequences. And of course, the last slide, just to show you this map, this is the map of Europe after World War I. The consequences of World War I and then ultimately World War II are basically the end of old Europe. The geopolitical map, the political map, I should say, of Europe is redrawn. New countries. After World War I, you see the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. The map is redrawn. Formerly large states are broken up into smaller states. Of course, too, I haven't even mentioned this. During World War I, what happens in Russia? Does anybody know? There's a revolution that overthrows the czars. And what revolution was that? Vladimir Lenin, V.I. Lenin, the communist revolution, overthrows the government. Right? World War I had long-reaching consequences for the world. The U.S. engagement with the Soviets would embody the 20th century. The Versailles Treaty and the First World War had a certain level of linkage with the rise of radicalism and fascism in Germany and the rise of the Nazis. And certainly World War I was connected to the mentality of the victorious powers and the mentality of the defeated powers. As the Nazis rose in Germany, they sought militarization, they sought revenge, they sought expansion. The French and the British, as well as the United States, in reaction to the First World War, wanted nothing to do with war. They took positions that were defensive, and often when pressed, they appeased the militarist opponent that was Nazi Germany.